The mono-ontological argument is certainly a convincing one. It is one of the few arguments for God that has given me pause. This argument is not without its fatal flaws, however. On first glance, I can see how it can be appealing to certain people. This argument was first brought to my attention because of a particular YouTuber who goes by the name Inspiringphilosophy. As to prevent bias, I suggest you watch his video, The Ontological Argument, the introduction. He is quite the fighter for Jesus, and I promise he will be a lot more enthusiastic about the argument as I am. So what is the mono-ontological argument? This argument is the argument that deals with the definition of God applied with modal logic. It goes as follows. Premise 1. It is possible that God exists. Premise 2. If it is possible that God exists, then God exists in some possible worlds. Premise 3. If God exists in some possible worlds, then God exists in all possible worlds. Premise 4. If God exists in all possible worlds, then God exists in the actual world. Premise 5. If God exists in the actual world, then God exists. Therefore God exists. This argument makes sense when God is defined as a maximally great being. According to the theist, a maximally great being must have all qualities that would be beneficial to have to its full extent. This includes characteristics such as love, charity, and strength. All of these would be stretched out to its maximum capacity to the point that they become infinite. This would be extended to existence. The argument supposes that necessary existence, or existence in all possible worlds, is better than existing in some possible worlds. Therefore, a maximally great being must necessarily exist. If this being is possible to exist, then following the premises, this being must exist because of its necessary existence. Like most theistic arguments, the majority versions of the ontological arguments can be dismissed without too much difficulty. However, this version made me think, and should be taken seriously. Even so, after thinking about it for a while, like all theistic arguments, it began to bleed fatally. Before I go into anything else, I must explain the nature of existence, as it is a crucial part to understanding the argument. Try to think of the traits of what would describe a leprechaun. Many would say that a leprechaun is short, magical, and non-existent, but they would be wrong. Allow me to explain. Imagine that leprechauns have just been discovered hiding in the hills of Ireland. You proclaim to yourself, "Yes, leprechauns do exist." But wait, do you notice the inconsistency? How could they be leprechauns if moments before they were defined as non-existent? This is absurd. Existence could not possibly be a trait. Actually, existence is a precondition for which things can have traits. It is important to note that when you're thinking of an object, you're actually thinking of the concept of an object and not the actual object itself. As the concept has every single trait that the actual object would have, and yet it does not exist, then it must follow that existence is not a trait. This has been known since the 1700s, as it was brilliantly pointed out by Immanuel Kant. Now that we have that squared away, let's get to the actual argument. In the argument, each great-making trait is carried out to its utmost extent. This screams fallacious reasoning to me. They assume that more of a good thing is better, and most is best, but this is obviously not always the case. If you don't believe me, please learn how a vaccine works, or try eating too much ice cream. Please take note, as this is extremely important to the argument. Let's apply this logic to impossibility, contingency, and necessity. These are adjectives that could be applied to beings, and the theist would argue that necessity is greater to have than contingency or impossibility. Let's examine that claim. The way I see it, there are two ways to go at this argument. The first involves the inherent greatness of each adjective. When one thinks of separate but related traits such as colors, usually there's nothing inherently greater about any particular trait than over another. There's nothing about blue that is inherently better than purple. Only when we apply these traits to different situations can we tell which is better and which is not. If the world was blue, then it would be better for the prey to be blue so that they could be camouflaged, and the same can be said about purple. Now let's apply this to impossibility, contingency, and necessity. Let's imagine a being that has almost every trait that would be better to have. Since I can imagine a situation in which it would be better to have pain, then this being would most likely have pain. Since I can imagine a world in which this practically perfect being is always in pain, I can imagine that it would be better for them not to exist. If I can imagine a world in which it is better for the being to not exist, then it follows that the being should never necessarily exist. If this is true, the assumptions made by the ontological argument are false, and therefore the argument is false. But do not despair, as there is possibly one way in which the argument could be saved. Instead of thinking of impossibility, contingency, and necessity as three separate adjectives, one could think of each term as simply a different degree of the same descriptive adjective. Then all the theist has to do is demonstrate that in its infinite state the trait is a great making property, and the argument will be valid. So what is the term that impossibility, contingency, and necessity are simply degrees of? So let's take a look. Impossibility is defined as existing in no possible worlds. Contingency is defined as existing in some possible worlds. And necessity is defined as existing in all possible worlds. Now let's see what common terms we have. Let's see, world. Well, you can't really be a world. Possible? No, that doesn't really make sense. Oh, I know. Existence. That's the common term. Obviously, contingency and possibility and necessity are simply different degrees of how much one can be existent. Now all we need to do is to demonstrate that existence is a great making property in its infinite state. Wait, do you smell that? Something seems a little fishy about this whole thing. I can't quite put my finger on it. Let's see, oh yes, thank you, Immanuel Kant. Thanks for reminding me. As previously stated, existence is not a property, so therefore this argument falls flat on its face. So I'm afraid this argument can be chopped up to a bunch of little logical fallacies, all mushed together. Still not convinced? Because of the fallacious nature of this argument, I can literally prove that anything exists using it. Watch and be amazed as I prove that unicorns absolutely must exist. Premise 1. It is possible that a maximally great unicorn exists. Premise 2. If it is possible that a maximally great unicorn exists, then a maximally great unicorn exists in some possible worlds. Because it is better to exist in all possible worlds instead of some possible worlds, that moves us to premise 3. If a maximally great unicorn exists in some possible worlds, then a maximally great unicorn exists in all possible worlds. Premise 4. If a maximally great unicorn exists in all possible worlds, then a maximally great unicorn exists in the actual world. Premise 5. If a maximally great unicorn exists in the actual world, then a maximally great unicorn exists. Premise 6. A maximally great unicorn is a unicorn, therefore a unicorn exists. Did I convince you that unicorns exist yet?